In this clip, I will focus on one important aspect of data collection that takes some time and is not always urgent, but very important: the codebook. A codebook is basically an overview of all your data collection procedures and variables, which summarizes the resulting data sets. This means that the most important information on your data is stored in one place and can be easily shared. It is recommended that you start the codebook before you start your data collection. And you keep updating it with new information as it comes up throughout the process of data collection. So it's an ongoing process. Keep track of any changes that you make over the waves. The codebook is useful at several stages of research, for example, but definitely not limited to pre-registration, writing papers, making changes in questionnaires, and data analysis. It's useful for you because you won't remember what you did today in 2 years, but it's also good for anyone you're collaborating with or future researchers that might be interested in performing secondary data analysis on your data. There are several ways to make a codebook, but the most common one is simply in Microsoft Word because it's easy and accessible. It gives you a lot of flexibility in the type of information and format that you want to include. And what I like is that you can also use automatic headings to easily structure and navigate your document. And you can, of course, export it to PDF when you're done. There's also other options that people use, which include Excel or simply a notepad file, which I would not recommend because it's not very easy to structure a document like that. And some people create wikis, but that's a bit more complex and I haven't actually seen it in use. But just know that there are several possibilities. So there are two types of information that you should include in a codebook. The first is general information about your project and your dataset as a whole. And the other is measure-specific information about every single questionnaire that you administered. So this could also involve information about other types of measurements, such as saliva samples, for example. So I think this should be common sense, but do not include any personal information on participants because you will share it with other people. It is also not recommended to include any actual data, such as means, because when pre-registering a paper, you have actually already seen some of the data. But in most cases, it is fine or even recommended to report reliability and missing statistics. So the core idea of the codebook is that someone you have never met should be able to read your codebook and get a good idea of what your dataset looks like, what the numbers mean, and where to find additional information. So I will now go through a couple of checklists and explain the most important points with some examples. But keep in mind that different types of project may need more, less, or different types of information. So always include the date when the codebook was last updated, especially when with ongoing studies. So you know that information of waves after that should probably be updated. And also include your name and email address once you start sharing the codebook with others, so that someone always knows how to reach out to you. This is not necessarily a priority, but especially when sharing with others, it might be useful to have a one-page summary of background of the aims of your study. Include information on your sample and your recruitment. If you have a multi-informant or full family design, include which informants participated in your study. And you can also include exclusion criteria, participants' age range, etc. Explain at what moments in time the waves took place. Was this the same for every participant? So, for example, all participants participated in the fall of 2020 and spring of 2021? Or was it centered around certain events? For example, 2 months before and 6 months after birth. Include an overview of all waves and what measurements were taken at that moment. This is most useful if you present it in a table form, and can also be really useful if your measures are not the same across all waves. If you have certain rules for naming your variables, explain them here. So for example, in transition uses 2 characters for the scale name, 1 character for wave number, 2 characters for informant direction, so who fills in this questionnaire about whom, and 2 or 3 numbers for item numbers. So in this way, we can convey a lot of information using a small number of characters in a variable name. Especially if you use M+, this is important. But either way, it's always to keep, it's a good habit to keep variable numbers at a maximum of 8 characters. If you have multiple data sets, list and explain them. For example, if the parent data set is separate from the adolescent data set. So any other general information about your project can be included here as well. So for in transition, we had a bit of a complex situation with friends who participated and friends who did not participate, and we explain it in more detail here. And it might also be the case that some questionnaires are only administered for certain participants, and here you can write it down as well. So I'll now go on through a checklist for measure-specific information that I think you should always include. It's important to be as specific as possible. So include the name of your construct very specifically, not just depression, but intensity of depression, for example. If you use an existing questionnaire, include its name, for example, Beck's depression inventory, as well as any references to the original authors, and if possible, to papers examining the psychometric qualities or adaptations that you use. So maybe a shortened version or a translation of it. Also include how the items were scored. So for example, on a scale from 1 to 4, and which labels were assigned to these values. Lastly, add all individual items, including item numbers and variable names. So keep the names short and consistent. I'll now go through the third and final checklist of measure-specific information that you might not always need, but can be very useful in some cases. So sometimes it's useful to add some general instructions that you gave participants. So for example, for the questions on this page, please think about your best friend. That would be a useful addition to all the items that you give. If your skill contains multiple subskills, adding a scoring system to show which items belong to which skills is important. So here you can include information on whether all items are weighted equally, if means or sum scores are preferred, or if the skill score is only calculated when a certain percentage of items are answered, so not missing. Sometimes certain questions need to be skipped depending on answers on previous questions. For example, a participant does not need to report on a relationship with their brother if they indicated that they don't have a brother. So always include these rules as well. If you use a multi-informant approach, indicate who is answering the questions about whom and in what waves, especially if measures aren't the same across waves. So this can be very simple if it's just on who is filling it, if there's just one person filling in the question, or the example on the bottom right is a lot more complex where a lot of people are reporting on a lot of other people. Note in what waves the questionnaire was or wasn't administered. If some changes were made to the items between waves, write it down here too. So for example, if you rephrased questions to be more clear, or if you had to shorten the questionnaire. After the data cleaning, you might also want to include some numbers on missingness and reliability of scales and items. Some people also report means and standard deviations, but it might not always be necessary to understand the data. And it might even mess up with your pre-registration. Include what steps were taken to clean the data. This is often the same or similar for many questionnaires, so this can also be a part of the general information. But in some cases, you might have 4 different procedures, and you indicate for each questionnaire which of the 4 procedures for data cleaning that you use for this one. If there is any information that is important to your measure, include it here as well. For example, Natasha used visual analog scale and included a picture of this scale as well as a more elaborate explanation on how it was coded. In transition, there were items that were filled out by multiple informants about multiple people, so we added some explanation on how the items were changed to fit all relationships. I want to end by giving some final tips. It's good to be prepared and keep track of what you do, but don't stress if it takes time and it doesn't look great or it's incomplete. The codebook should be there to help you and not to stress you out. And it should also work for you, so be flexible. If these checklists don't work or you want to put it in a different format, of course, feel free to adapt. And lastly, although I've mainly talked about longitudinal survey type studies, codebooks or other type of metadata can also be used for many other types of studies. So for example, cortisol measures in saliva, descriptions of experiments or tasks, and the variables that result from coding.